The moment that defined the chaos of the 21st century. A financial atomic bomb exploded in the heart of the world's banking system, sucking up the lifeblood of the global economy, the credit that keeps the wheels of fortune turning. Banks grown too big to go bust held nations to ransom. Trillions of dollars cascaded into the bankers' vaults. Leaders of the 20 largest economies promised never again. But once again, they betrayed their duty to protect the wealth and the welfare of their people. The American dream, a land of freedom and prosperity if you were willing to work. But first, Indians had to be cleared from their homelands, forced off their hunting grounds, herded onto reservations to be controlled.
We know the history that we share. It's a history marked by violence and disease and deprivation. Treaties were violated. Promises were broken. You were told your lands, your religion, your cultures, your languages were not yours to keep.
For millions of Europe's refugees, this was the start of a new life.
Was opened. The established eastern settlements and communities offered little opportunity for land ownership. The countryside through the valleys and forests were rich in wild game and black soil, and the American pioneer knew how to use both once he had decided on the spot he wanted to settle. But before he could reach his destination, he would have to conquer the weather, wide swollen rivers, high mountains, protect himself, his cattle, and his possessions, and fight hostile Indians whose land he was invading.
But as the wagon masters led them westwards to the promised land, for many the dream turned into a nightmare. The land was enclosed by the old world aristocracy, their workers imported from Africa, a labour force captured by slave traders and crated into the great ships that ploughed the Atlantic. And the engine of economic growth kept breaking down. Hopes raised by boom times were dashed by busts. American capitalism lurched between production on an awesome scale to the destruction of people's savings and their welfare. Mysteriously, land on a continent of vast spaces was beyond the grasp of millions of families. Landowners considered themselves free of responsibility to their communities.
I find that you make your living from being in the real estate business. But when you rent a house, you contract not only between yourself and your tenant, but also with the community. This is the third time that you've been before this court. You've had ample time. I think that the city has been more than fair in this case. The houses you rent, houses which you do not keep in decent, livable condition, are a menace not only to your tenants, but to the city of Baltimore. Mr. Hallen, I therefore find you guilty, and the fine is $50 and costs.
Baltimore, a major port of entry for immigrants to the United States, refugees attracted to jobs in steel mills, shipbuilding yards, and car manufacturing. But the prosperity was not to last. In the 20th century, even as the Soviet Union yielded to the American superpower, the great industries were in decline, but fortunes were still to be made out of real estate.
The first cracks in the New World Order surfaced in poor neighborhoods like this one across America and Europe. People borrowed money to buy homes they couldn't afford. Inevitably, they defaulted on their mortgage repayments, triggering the banking crisis.
Subprime mortgages blighted whole neighborhoods. Boarded-up houses were vandalized, driving down the value of next-door properties. Banks escaped the oversight needed to protect people who borrowed money. Baltimore's council claims that one bank, Wells Fargo, targeted low-income neighborhoods. When the bust came, foreclosures in African-American streets were 3 times higher than white neighborhoods.
A group of consumers anxious to borrow money and therefore susceptible to the kinds of marketing that Wells Fargo and their agents engaged in.
The lending and banking institutions, when they drew up contracts with interest rates, with flexible interest rates, I think they knew in the beginning that these problems were going to come back later on, where folks weren't going to be able to afford the mortgages as the interest rates increased. It put a lot of people in situations where they were taking food out of refrigerators, taking kids out of higher education. They're not able to afford college anymore. And it is making a really, really bad situation worse.
The council plotted the foreclosure of homes on maps. 70% of vacant properties were in African-American streets.
These are loans which were made by one of the major lenders in the city and in this country, Wells Fargo, in which Wells Fargo targeted minority communities in the city, put borrowers into loans that they could not afford, put borrowers into loans that were of the subprime variety, therefore more expensive and less advantageous to the borrowers.
We don't get the same opportunities, we don't get the same rates, we don't get the same fixed contracts as the other races of people do in this country.
What the banks had was the following utopia. They could charge the blacks and the Hispanics a higher interest rate by saying you're risky because you're poor, and at the same time they could get the bond rating agencies to give these AAA ratings, AAA ratings as safe as government, as if there were no risk at all, while the banks were charging for risk.
The lenders got out of these transactions quickly. Shortly after making the loans, they packaged these loans with other loans and then put them into the secondary market. So Wells Fargo, as the initial lender, no longer had a stake in the action. They and others involved in the original loan got their money up front, and it was somebody else's problem to worry about if and when the foreclosure numbers came in high years down the road, as of course happened.
The banks did know the consequences of their action, and we know that because they prepared for it for many years. They prepared for it legally, they prepared for it in the way that they set up the mortgages, they prepared for it in the way that they were able to package the mortgages and sell them on to hapless purchasers.
They're not worrying about, they don't come in the heart of it. Like, you in the heart of it, so you see, they don't really see the struggle if they don't come in the heart of it. They see the outside of it. That's like looking at the cover of a book and seeing the outside of a book, but if you don't go inside the book, then you'll never know what the book about. So they're not worrying about nobody else but themselves.
Wells Fargo denies engaging in financial malpractices. Then, overnight, America's banks tipped into bankruptcy. Bankers needed money, and they needed it fast. Taxpayers came to the rescue as the illusion of the American dream faded for families who lost their homes and jobs.
Our world is in chaos, but we can trace all the social, economic and environmental crises to a common cause, the way we abuse each other in the scramble to monopolize the riches of Earth. But we can't solve these problems while governments conspire with corporations to control other people's natural resources.
We economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire, and we've done it primarily without the military. We work many different ways, but perhaps the most common is that we'll take a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. However, the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our own corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, highways, industrial parks, things that benefit a few wealthy families in that country as well as our corporations, but don't help the majority of the people at all. They're too poor to buy electricity or drive cars on the highways or don't have the skills to get jobs in industrial parks. But they're left holding a huge debt. It's such a big debt that the country can never repay it. And so at some point, we economic hitmen go back in and say, listen, You can't pay your debts, give us a pound of flesh, sell your oil real cheap to oil companies.
But we won't be able to reform the laws if we allow corporations to compromise the democratic process by buying the privileges that put their profits above the interests of everyone else.
Part of democratic processes, the Congress should have a say on the way money gets spent. That's part of democracy. But it's not a reflection of good democracy when a company, a group of companies, an industry, says our interests are more important than the national interest. How can that happen? Very easy. That's the role of campaign contributions, lobbying in American in America's political structure. We have a flawed democracy. Not an accident, for instance, that we had the deregulation in our financial industry that was such a disaster. The lobbyists of the finance industry amount to 5 per congressperson. In other words, they pay 5 people for every congressman to explain to them, persuade them, that they should pass legislation that is favorable to the financial industry. Obviously, the poor people who are devastated don't have the money. They couldn't hire 5 per congressman. So the way our democracy works, it's an unlevel playing field. And, it's obviously the direct money through campaign contributions, but it's also the indirect influence through ideas. One person is there day in and day out explaining, trying to convince them that deregulation was the way to go. And they were duped. And the other one wasn't there to say, by the way, you're wrecking the lives of millions of Americans.
But governments won't be able to adopt rational policies if economists continue to shroud the facts about land and natural resources in myths.
Then there are major universities. Let's take Princeton University. One of its outstanding economists is quoted in the papers every week. He has a textbook in which he says that rent is only 1% of the national income. This chap is a very liberal, very public-minded person. In fact, Republicans regard him as a menace. He's so radical. But when it comes to economic rent, he puts in his book that it's just 1% of national income, and therefore not worth thinking about as a source of revenue.
Our world is out of control, the legacy of the West's dirty secret.
Las Vegas, the desert city built on a mirage, the mecca for gamblers who dream of jackpots. High rollers risk their stakes on the roulette wheel, but governments are the biggest risk takers, allowing people's homes to be used as chips, gambling that their policies will keep the economy growing. When the house of cards collapses, dreams disappear into the desert sands. In California, the gamble was called Proposition 13. This placed a legal limit on the revenue that could be raised when people's homes are taxed. But governments need money to build or repair highways and schools.
Now, since we passed Proposition 13, we can't raise it from the property tax. And this is one of the main reasons we have the highest income tax, the highest sales tax, and the highest various kinds of social overhead costs for labor imposed on employers of any state in the Union, all of which is helping drive people and industry away from the state.
California suffered one of the deepest collapses in house prices. The state's Terminator governor, Hollywood actor Arnold Schwarzenegger, couldn't save government from bankruptcy. Casino capitalism breeds poverty and destroys wealth, but governments turn blind eyes on the causes of property boom-busts.
The collapse actually began in residential streets across America and Europe. Lives are shattered when people speculate in property. Governments want us to believe that the credit crunch is something new. But the insane practices of real estate, which manifest themselves in different forms, have been with us for 200 years.
For hundreds of years, the one activity common to all business crises was land speculation. Land attracted speculators because its value rises faster than income from working or from investing in man-made capital. In 1776, Adam Smith revealed the secret of the land market.
Every improvement in the circumstances of the society tends either directly or indirectly to raise the real rent of land, to increase the real wealth of the landlord.
Adam Smith identified the trend that remains with us to this day.
A greater proportion of the nation's income must, consequently, belong to the landlord.
This gave overwhelming economic power to the idle rich. Smith called that class the public enemy.
The landowner acts always as a monopolist and exacts the greatest rent that can be got for the use of his land.
Conflict capitalism survived until the balance between producers and predators snapped in the 1980s. Millions of wage earners were persuaded to become predators. Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States lured people into the ranks of the property-owning democracy.
So popular is our policy that is being taken up all over the world, from France to the Philippines, from Jamaica to Japan, from Malaysia to Mexico, from Sri Lanka to Singapore. Privatisation is on the move. And there's even a special oriental version in China. The policies we have pioneered are catching on in country after country. We Conservatives believe in popular capitalism, believe in a property-owning democracy, and it works.
People stopped saving because economists told them the rising value of their homes was the nest egg for their retirement years. But the house of cards was built on debt. The boom-bust cycle repeats itself like clockwork. In the 19th century, America's bankers became the new financial aristocracy, using railways to make fortunes by tapping the vast natural resources of the continent. In the 1930s, one man embarked on a mission to track down the causes of property boom-busts. Homer Hoyt chronicled the value of land in Chicago over 100 years. He discovered that business cycles lasted for an average of 18 years. Armed with this knowledge, Hoyt helped developers build urban America. But then he turned himself into a speculator, buying vacant parcels of land around Washington. He even took to the air in a biplane, flying along the Florida coast to search for prime vacant locations. One day he would pocket the capital gains. Governments are not planning to terminate those property cycles.
The West's entrepreneurs need to prepare for the clash with the titans of the East, because tighter regulation of the banking system will not prevent the next property boom-bust. The foundations for that boom are being laid in suburbs across Florida. Property speculators are plotting even larger developments for what they hope will be the good times on the other side of these sand dunes.
The shift in taxation is the key clause in a new social contract which would overturn 5 centuries of political betrayal by kings and politicians who are supposed to be the guardians of people's wealth and welfare. Henry VIII, famous for his 6 wives and executing 2 of them. But Henry's biggest atrocity was the theft of land. He demolished a religious life that existed for 1,000 years and impoverished the people of England.
Henry created the modern state in his personal image. He triggered the first great land privatisation in the history of England. But in squandering the rents on luxury living, Henry and his successors exposed the sovereign freedoms of the nation to a class of people, the aristocracy, who put their private interests first. Now, what has that history to do with the charge of treason? The legitimacy of those kings and queens and the politicians who followed them rested on their duty to protect the security and the welfare of the nation. In repeatedly betraying that duty, they were guilty of acts of treason, and that charge of treason can be levelled against many governments in the 21st century.
Once the aristocracy acquired a share of Henry's land, England's fate was sealed. The culture of land grabbing sent the ship of state on a course of plunder. But some statesmen inside the Mother of Parliaments had the courage to name the culprits. Edmund Burke, one of Britain's greatest historians, denounced Henry as a tyrant.
one of the most decided tyrants in the rolls of history, who bribed the members of his two servile houses with a share of the spoils, and, holding out to them an eternal immunity from taxation, to demand a confirmation of his iniquitous proceedings by an Act of Parliament.
Henry defended himself by charging other people with treason. But, wrote Burke, it was those kings and queens and the politicians who followed them who violated people's common rights to land. Solving the crises of the 21st century begins with reforms to the way governments raise revenue. Adam Smith explained that to achieve efficiency and fairness, a modern economy needed to tax land. Instead, Parliament invented the income tax. Adam Smith's land tax was popularised by Henry George. Writing in Progress and Poverty, he explained that poverty and unemployment were inevitable when people were deprived of their share of the rent of land.
Henry George was extremely popular in his day. His book, Progress and Poverty, outsold every other book except the Bible and was translated into all languages. But the economists and the landed interests that they represented, the vested interests, managed to create an image of Henry George as a kind of kook.
Landowners want to disguise the social character of the revenue from land. But it was this revenue that converted communities from the edge of subsistence into flourishing societies, beginning with the ancient city civilizations in Mesopotamia. At the beginning of the 20th century, Britain's Parliament enacted a law to shift taxes from wages. Lloyd George and Winston Churchill wanted to fund the needs of the sick, the aged and unemployed out of the rent of land. The landlords fought back. Lord Selborne denounced Churchill as a malignant lunatic.
This tax shift is the key clause in a new social contract. With that tax reform in place, people's trust in government would be restored. Why? Because government would be forced by the people to tailor its spending according to the rents that we, the people, were prepared to pay for the public services that we want.
But time for a new social contract is running out. China, rich in cash and low-cost labour, will capture an ever-growing share of the global markets. Without tax reform, a weakened West cannot compete with the Orient. The West's future will be even bleaker if China discovers Hong Kong's money-making secret. As a British colony, Hong Kong raised its revenue by using Adam Smith's land tax. Land was leased by merchants. Trade flourished. Merchants paid rent to the colonial government, so taxes on wages and profits could be kept low. Today, Hong Kong is the most dynamic, prosperous and free market economy in the world. If China adopts Hong Kong's financial model, it would land a fatal blow on the economies of Europe and North America.
We can't blame China for the social crisis in the making because Western governments refuse to prevent the next round of land speculation. This means the prospects are grave because a weakened West will not be able to claw back its share of the global markets. Whole regions will suffer, betrayed by the politicians who should have protected their people.
Standard economic thinking says that you can achieve efficiency from any starting point. But in practice, that's not true. In order to achieve efficiency, in order to get the pricing institutions that motivate people to use resources efficiently, you have to first take taxes off of productive activities, and secondly, you have to make sure that people have enough in the way of opportunities that you don't mind charging them for the cost of all their choices. So efficiency means pricing the environment correctly, pricing all the things we use correctly, and rewarding people appropriately for the work that they do. And the basis on which to do that is to say that we're going to share the revenue from the use of the earth equally, and then allow people to keep what they produce.
And the most important element of a tax system is to do what everybody expected to be done in the 19th century, and that is to base the tax system on land taxation, on the free lunch of land value, on natural monopolies, and on what John Stuart Mill called the unearned increment, the income that landlords made in their sleep, as he put it. And if the government's used this land site value that's supplied by nature, not by human labor, not by personal enterprise, then the government would not have to tax wages in the form of income tax. It wouldn't have to imply sales tax that add to the price of doing business, and it wouldn't have to add the proliferation of business taxes.
I think that people, once they understand and open their minds to this, do think that raising more revenue from land and less from effort and less from sales and less from production makes sense to them. I mean, just think about it yourself. If you could see avoiding income taxes and having that money to spend, we'd have a much more prosperous economy. When you spend it, if you could avoid sales taxes, we'd have a more prosperous economy. And when we can raise the same amount of revenue from a source that's non-distortionary, one that's equitable, which is land, one which has basically produced the value from the community, it only makes sense to reduce on effort and production as much as possible.
So over a period of time, hopefully, as democracy is strengthened and people get to recognize issues, the correct economic and financial policies on regard to land taxation will also evolve.
The annual losses of income from today's taxes are enormous.
I estimate that it costs the American economy about $800 billion a year to have the taxes that we have. That's $5,000 per worker. If we were to finance the government instead by taxes on land and other sources of revenue that don't have an excess burden, the long-run effect would be a higher growth rate, not just the $5,000 per worker per year, but significantly more every year, more and more every year, because of the higher growth path that we would be on.
Parliaments are bound by law to protect the welfare and the wealth of the people of their nations. But they conspired to molest people's common rights. This was the treason against the sovereignty of the people, which even blighted the politics of democratic governance.
This economic crisis began as a financial crisis, when banks and financial institutions took huge, reckless risks in pursuit of quick profits and massive bonuses.
The economic crisis actually began in Baltimore, USA, and Birmingham, England, and in the streets from Madrid to Mumbai, from Shanghai to Dublin, caused by the unsustainable rise in house prices. The bonuses of bankers were dwarfed by fortunes made by land speculators.
We have to enact common-sense reforms that will protect American taxpayers and the American economy from future crises as well.
Re-regulating the banks will not prevent the next financial crisis. Banking crises occur under weak regulation, tough regulation, and no regulation.
Never again will the American taxpayer be held hostage by a bank that is too big to fail.
The next banking crisis and bailout will follow the property boom of 2020.
But what we've seen so far in recent weeks is an army of industry lobbyists from Wall Street descending on Capitol Hill to try and block basic and common sense rules of the road that would protect our economy and the American people. So, if these folks want a fight, it's a fight I'm ready to have.
Fighting bankers won't alter the incentives that drive reckless speculation when people scramble to make money out of land.
We simply cannot return to business as usual.
The next bubble in real estate has begun. House prices in China soared in 2010. Global business will crash again in 2028 because governments refuse to abolish the bad taxes and reform the way we pay for the services we share in common.
This area and the border area between Afghanistan and Pakistan is the crucible for global terrorism.
The most powerful man on earth, combating the Taliban in the most dangerous place on earth. Barack Obama's plan to defeat terrorists is like throwing petrol on a fire. The president's dream of peace is straitjacketed by economic policies that incubate the seeds of violence. How did the most powerful man on earth become prisoner of a false economic doctrine which threatens the security of the United States and nations around the world? Capitalism was conceived nearly 500 years ago with a royal act of sacrilege. When Henry VIII demolished the religious life of his nation to enrich himself, he laid the foundations for the kind of violence that now blights every corner of the world.
Henry VIII destroyed 600 monasteries and stole their land. That land was England's welfare system, a social safety net. The monks looked after the poor and the sick, using the food that they grew in the fields around their abbeys. Henry launched the sale of that land to the aristocracy, and the new landlords used the rents to fund opulent lifestyles. But as they gorged themselves in the London salons, the poor and the sick had to fend for themselves. By this one act of sacrilege, Henry incubated a new kind of greed, which knew no limits, and which eventually infected the rest of the world.
While Henry grew obese, living off the fat of the land, hunting deer in his parks, freeborn men and women of England were ejected from their commons, turned into vagabonds, forced to beg their way along the highways.
Henry invented a new kind of statecraft based on greed. This was to become the financial model on which today's nations are built. Instead of using the rents from the lands held by the Crown Estate to fund the public administration, he began to sell that land to his friends and to the money merchants in the City of London. Henry wanted ready cash so that he could build palaces like this one at Hampton Court. And by the end of his reign, he owned 50 palatial homes.
Henry's statecraft laid the foundations for the violent streak in capitalism, a culture of greed that triggered the lust for more land that could never be satisfied. Henry's maritime fleet laid the foundations for what would become the greatest empire in history. Capitalism evolved from a civil war in the 17th century, harnessing wrecking technologies to destroy ancient cultures in the 18th century, mutating from colonialism in the 19th century to fascism in the 20th century. In the past 100 years, wars over territory cost the lives of about 180 million people. The scorch marks of the landed aristocracy's lust for rents can be traced through the violent deeds of history. Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, they all scrambled for their share of other people's natural resources. But to grab land, they first had to displace the tribes that occupied their homelands. By separating people from their land, the foundations of whole communities were destroyed. Resentments were nurtured that would one day put suicide bombers on the streets of London and Madrid.
Around the world, people's hopes were raised when America elected as its president a man whose family came from humble beginnings in Africa. Today, Barack Obama lives in the White House. But his wish to champion a politics of peace will be buried in Pakistan. That's because he walked straight into a trap. That trap was laid by a doctrine that privileges the people and the corporations that own the land.
Pakistan, the country at the frontier of the fight against fanatics. A country weakened by the legacy of British colonialism.
The feudal class is the land-owning class in Pakistan. They have been there since colonial times. During colonial times, at the start, they were small feudals. They were not big feudals. And the British government, the British colonial government at that time would reward those who supported them with gifts of vast lands. If not gifts, then tax-free occupation and use. And when the colonial government began to weaken, they seized that moment to consolidate their holdings.
Pakistan's army is a major owner of land.
They have vast agricultural lands growing all kinds of crops. They have food processing industries. They don't have to worry about food security. They've made themselves secure by taking into hand that much agriculture.
Most Pakistanis struggle for survival on the margins of the economy. President Obama believes that spending $7.5 billion in Pakistan to raise living standards will weaken Islamic fundamentalists. But because of tax policies, this money will deepen poverty in both Pakistan and America and play into the hands of the Taliban.
I think the investment of the United States in Pakistan will achieve nothing, or perhaps worse than nothing. It's a matter of our paying their taxes for them. Now, this kind of horizontal equalization is a name given to taking money from one region and spending it in another. It's been lampooned, and very correctly so, as taking money from poor people in rich places to subsidize rich people in poor places. Pakistan is one of those poor places. But most of the land in Pakistan is held by a tiny minority of the population who collect rent from the others or employ the others to work on their estates. It is one of the more concentrated land ownership patterns in the world. It makes no sense at all for us to tax American workers, especially the lowest income workers, to subsidize these landowners. They can and should pay for their own infrastructure. And if they did, they would be motivated to put their land to better use, because that's the effect of taxing land values.
Governments need to spend money on improved roads and running water. But when they do, the main benefits are turned into higher land prices. In the countryside, this means that tenant farmers have to pay high rents to their landlords. In the towns like Karachi and Islamabad, when US tax dollars are invested, they drive up land prices. The main benefits go into the landlord's pockets. More people are driven into the slums, and it's there that the fundamentalists use the name of Allah to recruit suicide bombers.
But if land values go up due to speculative reasons, then that it will actually cut into economic activity. Manufacturing activities will actually shut down manufacturing and use the land for either housing or other more lucrative purposes. So your industrial sector will shrink. And this is what is happening in Pakistan. Land values have gone up, and there's a very large industrial estate in Karachi called SITE. And if the government can allow construction of housing there, I think 90% of industries will shut down and convert their land into housing.
The Taliban know that landlordism is the major cause of discontent in the fields and urban backstreets.
The relationship between the landowner and the peasant is one of bondage. The peasant is dependent on the landowner for being allowed to work on the land, for being allowed to live on the land. The peasant has indebted to the landowner for his needs. If he needs money for anything, for taking care of an illness, the landlord will give the money, which will be considered as advanced wages. And when the crop comes out, the wages are deducted, and this is where the exploitative relationship sets in. The peasant is uneducated. He does not keep his accounts. The landlord does. And somehow his debts keep multiplying, they never end. And as a result, the entire family is indebted.
The Taliban took control of Pakistan's Swat Valley by driving out the landlords. When Pakistan's army routed the Taliban in 2009 from the Swat Valley, about 3 million people were displaced across the country. Some of them ended up in this suburb in Karachi, but the security forces won't allow us to go into the streets because it's too dangerous. It's a hornet's nest of drugs pushers, money launderers, even kidnappers.
That cancellation is necessary. It is can be carried out. But some kind of land reforms have to be accompanied by it. Because if we cancel debts and leave them in the same structural position, they will acquire new debts. There has to be a land policy where rural families have a minimum size of land, which of course means that everybody will not get land. We can't have half-acre plots. Agriculture cannot function in that kind of situation. But excess labor in agriculture have to be drawn into urban areas. But then we have to provide jobs in urban areas. We have to have a situation where there is rapid industrialization.
Pakistan's parliament, dominated by feudal landlords, refuses to reform the distribution of income through tax reform.
Pakistan is like a factory where all the sales revenue is used to maintain the head office and the army of security guards. And there is no money left for spare parts and raw materials. That factory will certainly shut down. That is where Pakistan stands today.
Asian countries are not alone in struggling with the legacy of colonialism. In the early 20th century, the lands of the tribes of Morocco were occupied by Spain and France. Today, a suppressed anger explodes hundreds of miles away in the streets of Baghdad.
Scientists used traces of DNA from the streets of Baghdad to identify the suicide bombers. 9 came from this town, Tétouan, in the foothills of the Rif Mountains in Morocco. At least another 21 individuals left this area to seek martyrdom. These young men were disillusioned with the daily struggle to earn a living. The foot soldiers of radical Islam were recruited from the army of the unemployed, whose communities never recovered from the rape of the colonial land grab.
Europeans plundered Africa for her gold, oil, copper and diamonds to feed the culture of greed. Civilized nations invented new strategies of violence. One was the concentration camp. In the 1890s, the De Beers and Kimberley mines generated a fortune in diamond rents. Labour and capital costs were covered by 1/3 or less of the price of the diamonds. 2/3 of the revenue was the rent of this precious natural resource. But the diamond mines were located on land contested by Dutch settlers. During the Boer War, Britain gained the upper hand by herding 110,000 Europeans into 47 concentration camps. Deaths averaged 250 a week. Women and children were among the 27,000 victims. There is no record of how many Africans died in their concentration camps.
Britain was not alone in using concentration camps in Africa. Italy reached across the Mediterranean and used them in Libya. Spain used them in the Caribbean. Concentration camps were essential tools for separating people from their homelands so that the European countries could dominate their territories.
You see the baby? Mm-hmm.
European farmers needed labour to work the land. Mining corporations needed workers to dig below the ground. Africans were corralled to do the dirty work, turned into a captive labour force by wrenching them from ancestral lands. To ensure they remained obedient, their cultures were dismantled. This was the fate of the Muslims of North Africa. Those histories inflame the minds of young people today, turning teenagers into fanatical jihadists.
To make sense of the terrible deeds of violence, such as the mayhem caused by suicide bombers, we need to remind ourselves that people are not naturally disposed to such evil ways. When we dig deep, we discover an anger and a hopelessness which germinates such behaviour. In weighing people's personal responsibilities for their actions, we need to understand how their lives and their communities were damaged by events in the past if we are to shape a better future.
Voices in the past warned of the economics of state violence. Thomas Paine, the 18th century political pamphleteer, denounced the social costs of a financial system that wrecked people's lives.
The landed monopolies produced the greatest evil. It dispossessed more than half the inhabitants of every nation of their natural inheritance without providing for them an indemnification for that loss, and has thereby created a species of poverty and wretchedness that did not exist before.
The landless class was excluded from the riches that funded opulent lifestyles.
The aristocracy are not the farmers who work the land and raise the produce, but are the mere consumers of the rent. They are the drones who exist only for lazy enjoyment.
Today, the economic virus unleashed by Henry VIII is not even recognised. That's why our communities remain divided between people who work, the producers, and those who enjoyed lives of idle luxury, the predators. The predators were able to exploit the producers because they occupied the seats of power in Parliament.
The landed interest in the House of Peers is a combination of aristocratical landholders who oppose their own pecuniary interest to that of farmer and every branch of trade, commerce and manufacture.
Thomas Paine knew that to retain their hold on the rents of the kingdom, the sovereign power vested in Parliament had to be perverted.
The people must be hoodwinked and held in superstitious ignorance by some bugbear or other.
Taxes were rigged to shift the costs of public services onto wages. In Britain, the aristocracy increased the tax on beer so that they could reduce the land tax.
What will mankind think of the justice of taxation when they know that the tax on beer, from which the aristocracy is exempt, yields revenue nearly equal to the whole of the land tax? The beer, consumed chiefly by the working people, should be subject to a tax that is equal to that on the whole rental of a nation, is a fact not to be paralleled in the history of taxation.
But when Britain's landowners tried to tax the American colonies in the 18th century, the settlers rebelled. Their revolution was based on the right to resist unjust taxes. Armed with John Locke's philosophy of natural rights, the Americans fought their mother country.
John Locke's treatise on the rights of the citizen to overthrow government was at the heart of the American Revolution against the British in the 18th century. When government fails to protect the property of the people, they are entitled to rebel. But no one case of abuse would justify rebellion. But if, as Locke put it, people suffered a long train of abuses, then the people were entitled to rise up and force government out of power.
Thomas Paine's theory of justice also inspired the revolutionaries. People did not owe allegiance to a sovereign that betrayed their welfare.
Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right to tax. Being bound in that manner is slavery. So unlimited a power can belong only to God.
Paine urged Parliament to switch taxes from people's wages onto the rents of landlords.
Every proprietor of cultivated land owes to the community a ground rent, for I know of no better term to express the idea, for the land which he holds.
Paine wanted the rents spent on pensions for the elderly and to fund the education of children. That financial architecture would dissolve the pandemic of violence that corrodes our civilization. So why, in this age of democracy, are the rents that we all create by working together still used against the mass of the people? Why is the President of the United States using policies that favor landlords, playing straight into the hands of the Taliban?
So this kind of help is actually going to be a hindrance. It's just going to make matters worse. It will bring this contrived war and terror into our rural areas. We don't want his money, and he should understand this. We have not been allowed to be independent. We have not allowed to be self-reliant to this day. And you cannot be self-reliant if from the very beginning people tell you that the only way to development and for you to become as advanced as the Western countries is through technology transplanted from the West.
Humans have taken control of the destiny of all life on Earth. What was once the domain of the gods is now in the hands of mortals, and their leaders are worshippers in a temple of doom. For hundreds of thousands of years, the oceans moved with the ups and downs in the levels of the greenhouse gases that bathed the planet. But then, 200 years ago, humans began releasing a new layer of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Some scientists say this will raise global temperatures, causing an environmental catastrophe. A rise in sea levels of just a few meters would flood most of the coastline of the United States. Around the world, thousands of cities would be submerged by nature's retribution. Governments say they want to reduce greenhouse gases and protect species like fish in the oceans that are exposed to the economics of greed.
The concept of environmental terrorism, I think, has to be appreciated at several levels. One, the whole system by which laws are administered in a country by the state and governments acting on behalf of the state. When governments themselves disregard the law and support or sponsor projects which are largely government financed, and they fail to observe the minimal requirements of environmental laws, that's the first act of environmental terrorism. The second is where non-state actors or non-governmental elements which are in the commercial sector proceed to either conduct deforestation or industrial fishing. For example, like all over the world, the coastline of Pakistan has also been adversely affected by allowing industrial type fishing in the past 2 decades. And that's another form of environmental terrorism, where you're not only terrorizing and decimating many species and swarms of fish species, but you're also adversely affecting the livelihoods of thousands, tens of thousands of people who depend on fishing for survival. And then thirdly, the manner in which chemicals are allowed to be used, toxic chemicals and pesticides in the industrial sector as well as in the agricultural sector. And the unchecked spillage of waste from the plants. And here, unfortunately, where we've set a world record in mangrove planting, we, I think, are amongst those who also break some norms in spilling 70 to 80% of untreated sewage into the Arabian Sea off the coastline.
But the green agenda has been hijacked. Governments are privatizing the income from nature. The heavens have been parceled up into permits that can be sold to investors. Earth's drinking water is being appropriated by landowners and corporations. Even the ownership of fish is being transferred to deep-sea trawlermen.
But what if the skeptical scientists are correct? What if there is no connection between the man-made greenhouse gases and global temperatures? How would we explain the intense political campaign to curb the emission of carbon dioxide? Well, the green agenda has been hijacked. Governments are privatizing the last of the commons, the oceans and the heavens, in what is turning into a vast financial scam. The climate change campaign is providing the political cover to turn the private corporate polluters into the land barons of the 21st century.
Bankers have found a way to get in on the act, gambling on the price of permits that are supposed to curb pollution. The countries most responsible for the environmental crisis are history's leading coal burners. First, the United Kingdom, followed by the United States and Germany. But according to Dr. Jim Hansen, the space scientist who heads NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies,
the dirtiest trick that governments play on their citizens is the pretense that they are working on clean coal.
But the coal industry is promoting the myth of clean coal.
You can reduce how dirty it is. It's much better than it was in 19th century England when you choked. People's life expectancy was shortened. So they've made a lot of progress. But in terms of greenhouse gases, it's physically impossible to burn coal without adding greenhouse gases. It's a physical impossibility.
To control the damage caused by coal and petroleum, governments have invented a scheme called cap and trade. In America, a political architect of this policy is Timothy Worth. Senator Worth steered cap and trade legislation through Washington, legalizing a money-making scheme which became the model for Europe's cap and trade.
It's hard for me to explain this system without feeling sick to the stomach. It basically takes the public air and turns it into private property. Not surprising that it came out of the University of Chicago. Privatizing natural resources through these subterfuges is unfortunately the universal pattern. It's something like the enclosure of common lands in England starting in the 16th century under Henry VIII. Lands previously assumed to be freely available to, if not all people, lots of people, are privatized, put to lower uses, in that case, sheep instead of growing food, and the rents accruing to a few number of people with influence at court.
But according to Jim Hansen, cap and trade is a cop-out. It is driving the world down a dead end to an ecological and social disaster.
Cap and trade is the temple of doom. It would lock in disasters for our children and grandchildren. Most countries that claim to have met their obligations actually increased their emissions. Others simply ignored their goals. Why is this cap and trade temple of doom worshipped?
We know that economists were the ones who pushed this onto policymakers. Is that when I was writing Building a Win-Win World, I actually came across a letter that was sent out by the British Economics Association president to all of the member economists. And he said, this climate change issue is going to become very important. We have to understand it, and then we have to suggest policies that will enable us to, quote, capture this issue for our discipline, for our profession, quote unquote. And so they were busy selling this idea, and it played into the market fundamentalism, which was very much abroad in this country at that time. And of course, they talked about it being a market-based approach. Well, of course, it's not a market at all. You know, it's created by legislation. I mean, it's actually a gigantic bureaucracy. And if you wanted to do a market approach to reducing carbon emissions, you would tax carbon. Very simple. And that's a much more market-based approach.
Virtually every decision is distorted because we aren't pricing some of the scarcest resources that we face. And what we need to do is begin to get better metrics that will help guide us to making these right decisions.
A price can be placed on coal pollution to help governments clean up the environment.
Revenue from the use of a natural resource could be thought of as a rent. So you could think of what people pay for permits as essentially a rent for using the atmosphere for disposal purposes.
Environmental activist Larry Lohman has witnessed the cap-and-trade system at close quarters.
There's something a bit worrying coming down the highway, and that's carbon trading, which looks to be shaping up to be the mainstream solution pursued by various governments and businesses to the climate problem. And we see this as a problem for us who are fighting these land issues, because what it means is that companies are going to be given money, they're going to be given finance in order to be able to, sequester carbon. They're going to be able to claim that they are cleaning up the world's atmosphere by planting their trees on people's land and get extra money for doing so. And as part of the same bargain, the big polluters in the northern industrialized countries will be able to say that they don't need to cut their own pollution because they're paying some plantation company in the global south to absorb their carbon dioxide.
Cap and trade saves money for polluters without putting pressure on them to cut emissions from cars, power stations and buildings.
Cap and trade is a way of dealing with the climate problem, which is based on neoclassical economic theory. The idea is that we can deal with the climate problem by engaging in incremental emissions cuts. Now, we don't talk about history, we don't talk about technology, we don't talk about fossil fuels even. What we talk about is trying to reduce our emissions by a certain numerical amount, usually a very small amount, every few years. And the trading part of that is really the neoclassical economists' big contribution to it, which is to say, well, let's do that in a way which saves the most money, especially for large corporations.
Europe spent $50 billion on trading the pollution permits. The largest payment went to a German coal-burning utility. The emissions of carbon dioxide actually increased.
The second part of carbon trading is called offsets, and this is an add-on to cap and trade. It's a supplement to cap and trade in a way. Think of it as companies coming along and saying, well, okay, this cap and trade business, it saves us a little money. It makes it a little cheaper for us to cut our emissions according to the regulations the government has set, but it's still not cheap enough for us. We'd like more pollution rights so we can delay real changes in our fossil fuel use even longer. We'd like more carbon credits. We'd like more pollution rights. What's the answer to that? The answer to that is carbon offsets. Suppose both A and B don't want to cut their emissions. Neither one wants to cut their emissions. Offsets provides both of them with a solution. They can go abroad. They can go overseas. They can, for example, say, okay, neither of us is going to cut our emissions, but we're going to pay some plantation company, for example, in Brazil, to plant trees, which will absorb the carbon dioxide that we give off. So we don't need actually to change away from fossil fuels. We don't need to think about a transition away from our fossil fuel dependence. We can put all those decisions off a few years and meanwhile pay these people in the global south or wherever, it could be even in the U.S., to do something which compensates for our emissions. What this has done in practice, actually, is this has set up incentives for very clever businessmen and women to think about, well, how many different kinds of equivalents to emissions can we think of? Okay, we've got plantations. Plantations absorb carbon dioxide. Let's think of some other ones. Okay, maybe we can dump some iron filings in the ocean to cause the ocean to absorb more carbon dioxide so we can continue pollution in that way.
Over time, the number of permits given out for emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is going to decline. The idea currently is that emissions should be down by 80% from their 1990 levels by 2050. So the number of permits is going to decrease very substantially, and the cost of each permit is expected to increase a lot. Currently, these permits are trading for about 15 to 20 euros for a permit to emit a ton of greenhouse gases. Forecasted that could be well over 100 euros within 5 to 10 years. And so the income stream from trading these permits could actually get quite large, from auctioning these permits in particular could get quite large. So that the permit market in general actually is expected to be a very major market indeed by sort of 2020, 2030. worth probably trillions of dollars annually.
Many people say that this will be the world's largest commodity market. Many people in the world's financial districts, from Wall Street to the City of London to elsewhere, are talking about this as the replacement for the gigantic derivatives market, which resulted in the economic crash, which we're all suffering through right now. So there are big plans for this market.
While the polluters get richer, hundreds of millions of landless people live on less than $1 a day.
My colleagues and I have visited many carbon offset projects in places like India. And many of these factories, for example, there are sponge iron factories in Chhattisgarh state that we visited that are getting lots of money from carbon credits under the United Nations carbon trading scheme. For what? For claiming to be doing their business, producing sponge iron, a vastly polluting enterprise, a little bit more efficiently. And when you talk to local people, their concern is with the dominance of this company in the local area, because it's taking over land, it's polluting water, it's taking over water, it's polluting the air, it's affecting their health and so forth. They don't necessarily want to hear about the supposed efficiency improvements that the company is making, because the company itself is the problem.
Changes in our treatment of nature are needed to deal with adjustments to the weather patterns or ocean levels, whether these are driven by climate warming or normal shifts in the state of the planet.
Many people are concerned about the carbon market actually leading to a bubble similar to the property bubble, which played such a role in the economic crash. Again, the problem is, how do you value these assets, these commodities that are being traded in this market? We have a situation today where, under the United Nations carbon trading system, under the Kyoto Protocol, most of the offset credits, most of the carbon permits produced by offset projects under the Clean Development Mechanism, which is a part of the Kyoto Protocol, are actually being bought up today not by polluters to offset their pollution. They're being bought up by Wall Street firms. I'm talking firms like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, and so forth. These firms are buying up these credits not in order to deal with their own pollution problem, which is not as serious as that of manufacturing industries. They're buying up these permits in order to gamble with them, in order to speculate with them, because they're assets which, if they increase in value, you can make money off that. If they crash, if they go down in value, you can short them. You can make money off that. You can make money off the way they go up and down, volatility. That's a way hedge funds, for example, make a lot of money. So all of these financial institutions are getting very interested in this carbon market, not only because it's big, and not only because the assets being traded in it are a new, exciting asset, which might be a little different from some of the other assets which they're trading in, but also because they just see it as a fantastic new opportunity to make money. So what we're seeing now is, in effect, a lot of climate policy is actually being passed de facto into the hands of Wall Street and the City of London. And, this is inevitable in a market of this kind. And one of the dangers of this, of course, is that it's going to help drive a bubble in carbon credits. And there's a real danger of this, is that there's a rush into these carbon commodities, which no one knows what they are, where they came from. I mean, they're being packaged, they're being sliced, they're being diced. Credits from a windmill project in India are being put together with credits from plantation project or an efficiency project in Brazil, being packaged, securitized, and so forth. You have the same kind of thing that you saw with the financial crisis, an extremely complex market of assets which no one really knows what they are. No one really understands them. And yet there's a lot of interest in them, and there's a lot of investment in them, which can drive the price up and up and up, until somebody realizes, well, gosh, what are we actually trading in? Do we really trust each other that we're trading in a real commodity here? Suddenly people lose confidence. People stop lending to each other. People lose interest in the market crashes.
A lot of money gets traded on Wall Street and in the City of London, where they trade these carbon derivatives between each other. But very, very little carbon gets taken out of the air.
An estimated 80 million people in Bangladesh alone are said to be at risk. They live on the delta, and if the oceans rise, their homes will be swamped. Already many Bangladeshis have sought refuge on the other side of the Indian continent, living here in Karachi, on the edge of the Arabian Sea, seeking a living. But if the oceans rise, they will once again be displaced, they or their children driven deeper into the heartlands of Islam, where governments are already in conflict over that most precious of natural resources, drinking water.
But governments are also giving away the value of life in the oceans. Oceans once teemed with life. Coastal communities like those in Iceland lived in harmony with the fish that fed them. Gunnar Thomasson, while working at the International Monetary Fund, discovered that the conservation agenda was a cover for speculating in the money markets. Corporations with factory-sized fishing vessels had the financial muscle to acquire the fishing permits. Iceland granted those permits without charging the full rental value of the fish off their shores.
The quotas have become a major instrument for raising funds from the banking system. This became a major source of funds for the financial speculators who have now driven Iceland into bankruptcy. Many fisheries firms didn't only do fishing, but went into speculation, using their quotas to raise funds to speculate in financial markets.
After the collapse of their banks, Icelanders realized that they needed to start charging rent for the right to fish their coastal waters. From the waters of the oceans to the rivers on the continents, many wars in the future will be fought over drinking water. Rivers are running dry, droughts turning fertile farmland into semi-deserts. In America, water scarcity began with the arrival of cattle ranchers. Governments failed to protect the rights of future generations as ranchers and farmers privatized the rents of water. Mason Gaffney, a professor at the University of California and a world authority on the economics of natural resources, denies that his state has a shortage of water.
It's not that nature has been so stingy. It's that human institutions have been counterproductive. Any student in elementary economics who studied supply and demand would tell you that if you set a zero price on something, the demand will exceed the supply. That's what's been done with water in California. And that's why we have chronic water shortages, so-called.
Today, property rights are based on the willful waste of water.
The early privileges were allocated in proportion to the previous ownership of land. And then the lawyers got busy and started using the word property and rights in respect to these, what are actually licenses. Now, a license is different from property. A license is terminable. A license is subject to conditions. There was no agency that was enforcing those conditions. There was no agency that even conceived of something like economical use as opposed to waste. So basically the idea was you established your almost perpetual privilege to take flowing water each year based on the amount that you wasted the year before.
In a state where water is publicly owned, distribution is rigged to favor the super rich.
The way this system works, first in time, first in right, means that those with the so-called senior claims get their water first in a shortage, and people at the end of the line with the so-called junior claims don't get anything at all. The shortages are not shared equally, in other words. So One group of water receivers who don't make out very well are these junior appropriators. The senior appropriators are the masters of mankind, so to speak, the super elite who get steady supplies of water paid for by the taxpayers, coming from the public domain, paying nothing for it.
But the water crisis is even more acute in the developing world.
The pricing and the distribution of water represents the character of the state. This is a state which spends more on the rich and extracts the resources from the poor. Let us look at the taxation system. The top 10% of the population, the richest 10%, pay 12% of their income in taxes, all taxes combined. And the poorest 10% of the population pay 16% of their income in taxes. So the poor are paying 4 percentage points more than the rich. If you look at the expenditure pattern, for every 100 rupees that the government collects, this year the government spent 122 rupees on itself. It has no money left to pay for economic infrastructure, either industrial or agriculture, which can provide jobs to people. It has no money for education. It has no money for health. It has no money for urban services or urban infrastructure. When the state fails to provide basic services to the people and expects the market to provide those services, then the poor cannot afford to access those services. They will be trapped in poverty.
Was the rape of the living landscape inevitable? If we are to rescue the environment, we need to understand how we institutionalize the abuse of nature. The steam engines developed by inventors like George Stephenson reduced the costs of carrying goods to market. Everyone could have prospered without damaging the environment, but only if landlords paid the full social and environmental costs for the use of coal. That would have encouraged the invention of clean technologies, harnessing the sun and the wind, creating prosperity for everyone that was beyond people's wildest dreams. But the dukes and barons claimed ownership of the coal. They favoured cheap, dirty technologies which raised their rents. This behaviour offended the doctrine of natural rights which the aristocracy claimed to believe in when it was penned by John Locke in his treatise on government.
The great and chief end of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property, the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name property.
It was here in the capital of Virginia in 1776 that the people declared their independence from the British. By that Old English word estates, John Locke meant land. Each of us had the natural right to life, to liberty, and to land. But we need to take a closer look at that word land, because in the period before Locke's social contract, each of us had two kinds of property. There was the private property that we created by our labour, shelter, clothing, hunting tools, and so on. But there was also the property that each of us shared in common, public property, and that property was land.
Traditionally, human societies treated land as a social asset. It was this common property which Britain's Parliament privatised. A prosperous industrial society was possible, but only if the owners of land did not pocket the rents from the coal under their land. But landlords controlled Parliament. They worshipped at the Temple of Doom, and they turned a deaf ear on the advice from Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations.
Ground rents are altogether owing to the good government of the sovereign. Nothing could be more reasonable than that a fund which owes its existence to the good government of the state should be taxed peculiarly.
But landlords were locked into a culture of greed, so the pioneers of Britain's infrastructure, bridge builders like Brunel and Telford, were not encouraged to invent the green technologies that harness the clean power of the winds and the ocean tides. Clean technologies become economical when people pay the full social and environmental cost of air travel and for driving on the highways. In America, adding $1 to the price of a gallon of gasoline would yield revenue of $670 billion. That could be paid back to the people as a dividend of $3,000 per person. About 60% of the people would end up with more money in their pockets, and the other 40% could cut their loss if they cut the carbon footprint they stamped on their communities. That was Adam Smith's tax revolution. Pay for using nature's resources and cutting taxes on wages. A new social contract is needed with nature.
This new constitution that Ecuador recently ratified overwhelmingly gives land total rights, inalienable rights. The forests, the rivers, the plants, the animals all have inalienable rights. In fact, basically what the Constitution says is we can't own them. They're there. We can participate. I think that's a very, very important concept because, after all, if you believe that I own this piece of land and I believe I own this piece of land and I'm abusing it, and you're an environmentalist, and you come along, you now have to somehow convince me that I've got to change my relationship to something that legally I own. That's very different from if we have a concept that says, I don't really own this land, it has its own rights and I'm living on it, and you come along as an environmentalist and say, yeah, but you're not living on it with respect, by giving it respect. You've got to follow the rules and give it respect. It seems subtle, but it's a significant difference. So I think ultimately we need to get away from the idea that anybody owns land at all, or any corporation owns land. The resources are there, but how do we use them and what do we give back to the land? How do we recycle? How do we charge for these things? And every time we take something out of the land, we ought to factor into the price what we've got to give back to the land through recycling or through whatever the process is, to continue a cycle that ensures that future generations of our own children and every other species' children on this planet will continue to have as much at their disposal as we do, and hopefully even more.
There are lots of things that need to be done about the environment, and the best way of dealing with them, generally, is to charge people for the harm that they do. So if we were to adopt the understanding that all people have equal rights to the earth, we would see it as both fair and efficient to require everybody who does environmental harm to pay for that harm. And we would find it much easier to adopt a consistent policy in pressing the rest of the world to do the same.
What we're dealing with here is an environmental crisis, a planetary crisis. And really we need emergency legislation. A universal declaration of planetary rights is just that. It is the international tools to use at point of emergency. We have reached that point, and we need to put that in place, and we need to actually vote it in as internationally binding from the outset. We can do that. Now, with that, then we can actually tackle this collectively. And with that, you also have a seismic shift in consciousness. People begin to understand that that which is damaging must stop.